For 30 years, Johnny Carson hosted a show built on the appearance of effortless, unscripted conversation, which meant that when a guest showed up altered by alcohol or drugs, as happened more than once during the freewheeling decades of the 1970s and early 1980s, it tended to show. Carson was known among his staff for handling these moments with a steady hand rather than making a scene of them. What's genuinely documented about a handful of these guests is less sensational than some retelling suggests, but it's also more human. Real people who spoke, often years later and often themselves, about what was actually happening. George Carlin, open about it and unapologetic. Of everyone regularly connected to substance use on The Tonight Show, George Carlin is the one who never hid it. Carlin appeared on the show more than 130 times over 3 decades, becoming, by his own account and his biographers, one of Carson's most frequent and dependable guests through the 1970s, a decade in which Carlin openly transformed his comedy and his public image alongside the broader counterculture. Through the mid-1960s, Carlin had built a mainstream career on tame, clean-cut characters like Old Sleet, the hippy-dippy weatherman, a bit that got him dozens of appearances on shows like The Ed Sullivan Show and The Tonight Show. But by his own later description, that success felt hollow to him. "I was a traitor, in so many words," he said. "I was living a lie." And around 1970, he deliberately traded his shoot and short hair for a beard, long hair, and material built around drugs, the Vietnam War, religion, and America's censorious attitude toward language, a shift that alienated some of his older nightclub audiences even as it made him a genuine hero to a younger, countercultural one. Carlin was candid for the rest of his life about how much drug use, cannabis in particular, factored into that transformation in the years that followed, discussing it plainly in interviews and in his posthumously published autobiography, Last Words, co-written with Tony Hendra. According to Richard Zoglin's History of 1970s Stand-Up, Comedy on the Edge, Carlin's drug use became heavy enough by the mid-1970s that it began to affect his health. He suffered the first of several heart attacks in 1978, problems that would eventually contribute to his death 3 decades later. He never pretended any of this wasn't happening, and neither, by most accounts, did anyone around him. It was simply part of the public persona he built, not something Carson or the show's producers ever needed to manage or disguise. Despite Carlin's popularity and his obvious rapport with Carson, Carlin was also chosen as the first-ever guest host of Saturday Night Live in 1975, a mark of how trusted a performer he was considered. He was never selected as a Tonight Show guest host during this stretch of his career, a role many other frequent comedic guests did receive. Biographers have speculated about the reasons for this without a definitive on-record explanation from Carson himself, so it would be inaccurate to claim certainty about exactly why. But the timing lines up with the years Carlin was most publicly associated with his own drug use. Cheech and Chong, the brand with the point. If Carlin's substance use was an open secret, Cheech Marin and Tommy Chong's was the entire premise of their act. The duo met in the late 1960s and built their comedy career explicitly around cannabis culture through a string of comedy albums before making the leap to film with 1978's Up in Smoke, a box office hit that cemented stoner comedy as a durable genre and cemented the pair's own public identity along with it. Their appearances on The Tonight Show throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, often timed to promote their films, traded on exactly that persona. Audiences tuning in to see Cheech and Chong weren't watching for subtlety. The entire joke of their public act was a kind of exaggerated, good-natured stoner haze, delivered with real comic craft underneath it. And Carson, whose on-air persona was famously buttoned up and clean-cut by comparison, made an easy comic foil for them without needing to editorialize about it one way or the other. This dynamic, a famously composed host across from unapologetically countercultural guests, became part of what made their joint appearances memorable, and it required no invented backstage drama to work. It was built into the premise from the start. In the same way Rodney Dangerfield's persona ran on manufactured anxiety or Don Rickles' ran on manufactured hostility. The joke was a joke, on camera, by design. Richard Pryor, addiction, a near-fatal fire, and a genuinely remarkable interview. Richard Pryor's struggles with cocaine are among the most thoroughly documented substance abuse stories in American comedy, almost entirely because Pryor himself talked about them at length, repeatedly, in his own stand-up, most extensively in his 1982 concert film Live on the Sunset Strip. By the late 1970s, his cocaine use had escalated into freebasing, a more intense method of smoking the drug that involved volatile, flammable chemicals, and on June 9, 1980, he was severely burned in an incident involving the drug. Accounts of exactly how the fire started have varied slightly over the years, including from Pryor himself, who at different points described it as an accident during the freebasing process and, separately, as pouring rum over himself and igniting it. The injuries were serious enough, covering roughly half his body, that early news reports mistakenly said he had died. He survived, underwent a long and painful recovery, and eventually returned performing and to substance use before ultimately achieving sobriety. What makes Pryor's connection to The Tonight Show genuinely notable isn't an invented scene of him drifting off mid-interview. It's a real, widely available 1981 appearance, alongside George Carlin, in which Carson directly and gently asked Pryor about the accident on the air while Pryor was there to promote his film Bustin' Loose. The exchange is frequently cited by film and comedy historians as a rare moment of real vulnerability breaking through a talk show format built around promotion. Carson asking with what comes across as genuine concern, and Pryor answering with a mix of self-deprecating humor and surprising candor about how close he'd come to dying before the conversation moves, in a way that feels very true to both men, into Pryor reminiscing warmly about his father and his early days coming up through stand-up alongside Carlin at Greenwich Village's Cafe AU Go-Go. 2 years later, in a 1983 appearance timed to the release of Superman 3, Pryor spoke on the show about being drug-free and discussed his past marriages, marking a visible, on-the-record change from the man who'd nearly died 3 years earlier. Neither of these real appearances needed to be dressed up with a fabricated scene of Pryor going somewhere else mentally mid-joke. What actually happened on camera was already a striking piece of television, precisely because it was unscripted and real. Truman Capote, a real problem, misattributed to the wrong show. Truman Capote struggles with alcohol and, later in his life, cocaine, are well documented by his biographers, by his own friends, and by Capote himself in some of his later interviews. But his single most notorious impaired television appearance, in which he was reportedly barely able to speak and profoundly slurring his words, happened on The Stanley Ziegel Show on July 18, 1978, not on The Tonight Show. Capote's actual surviving appearances with Johnny Carson, including a 1972 conversation about In Cold Blood and a 1975 discussion of an unsolved multiple murder case he'd been following, show him compose, articulate, and delivering the kind of sharp, catty one-liners he was known for, at one point calling Marlon Brando so dumb it makes your skin crawl. It's worth being precise about this, because the two shows and the two appearances are genuinely different events, and folding the Stanley Ziegel incident into Carson's show, as some retellings of Tonight Show history have done, misrepresents both what happened and where. Sammy Davis Jr., candid in his own memoir, without a specific documented Carson incident. Sammy Davis Jr. was, by his own telling, extraordinarily candid about his personal excesses. His 1980 autobiography, Why Me?, written with Jane and Bert Boyar, discusses his struggles with alcohol and drugs in blunt terms, alongside his complicated relationships with fame, money, and his own identity. Davis was a frequent and beloved Tonight Show guest across decades, appearing as early as 1967 and continuing regularly into the late 1970s. What isn't independently documented, as far as available records show, is any specific Tonight Show appearance where his condition became a matter of on-air concern in the way it sometimes did for other guests. His own memoir discusses the broader pattern of his addiction, without pointing to that particular stage as a place it became visible to audiences. What this actually says about the era and about Carson. The genuinely documented pattern here is narrower than the more sensational version suggests, but it still says something real. The 1970s entertainment industry had a much higher tolerance for open, even celebrated, drug use among its biggest stars than would be conceivable today, and Carson, whose own on-air persona stayed carefully controlled regardless of what was happening around him, built a show that could accommodate performers like Carlin and Cheech and Chong without needing to comment on or hide what audiences already knew. Where things turned serious, as with Pryor's addiction and near-fatal accident, Carson's handling of it on camera reads, in the surviving footage, as careful and genuinely concerned rather than exploitative. That's a real and interesting story on its own. It doesn't need a fabricated scene of a literary icon being banned